My dad sold our family cabin, the last memory of my late mom, without telling me. Now, I've bought it back. But it cost me my family. I, 29M, grew up with this cabin that my mom's family owned for decades. It was tucked away by a lake, surrounded by thick woods, where my mom used to take my siblings and me camping. It was nothing fancy, a bit run down actually, but it had character, with creaky wooden floors, a wood-burning stove, and walls covered in photos of our family trips over the years. My mom loved that place, and even though she passed away when I was 17, the cabin was where I felt closest to her. Back then, my dad promised we'd keep it in the family. He talked about it like it was our legacy, something we'd pass down. So I assumed it was just a matter of time before he'd hand it down to me, or one of my siblings. But then he remarried, and things started shifting in subtle but uncomfortable ways. His new wife, my stepmom, moved in a few years ago. At first she seemed nice enough, but after a while it felt like she wanted to erase every memory of my mom. The family photos disappeared from the living room, and she redecorated in this ultramodern style that looked nothing like the cozy home I grew up in. I didn't say much because I thought, it's Dad's life. Let him do what he wants. But the cabin felt different. It was too tied to Mom and our memories together. I didn't expect him to mess with that. Then a few months ago, I started noticing little signs that my dad might be struggling with money. He mentioned a couple of bad investments, but brushed it off whenever I tried to dig deeper. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. Around this time, whenever I bring up the cabin, just casual stuff like planning a weekend there, or maybe making small repairs, he'd quickly change the topic or say we'd talk about it later. One day, I stopped by my dad's house, hoping to catch him alone. My stepmom was out, so I thought it would be a good time. We got to talking, and out of the blue, he drops the bombshell he sold the cabin. No warning, no heads up, just I sold the cabin last month. I remember just sitting there, trying to process it. This place, the one thing left that felt like my mom, was gone, and he didn't even tell me until it was over. I felt like I'd been hit in the gut. All I could manage to say was, why? Dad went on about how he needed the money, and how it was the only option given his financial situation. He acted like it was no big deal, like it was just a property he could sell whenever he wanted. But this wasn't just some random asset. It was part of our family, our history, and he just let it go without so much as a conversation. When I asked who bought it, he got all vague, saying it was a private buyer and not to worry about it. That made it feel even worse. Who were these people? What would they do to the cabin? The whole thing felt off. I was angry, and I didn't hold back. I told him exactly what I thought, that he was selfish, that he should have at least talked to me first, that he had no right to do this behind my back. His response, if you want it so badly, why don't you just buy it back? It felt like he'd slapped me. Here he was, the person who sold it without a word to me, now telling me I should just buy it back, as if it was some kind of test, like he was challenging me to prove how much I cared about it. I was still in shock, and I think he knew that, but he didn't let up. My stepmom had come home by then, and she chimed in, saying something about how I should step up if the cabin meant that much to me. But here's the kicker. They knew I didn't have that kind of money. They'd sold it at a time when I was just trying to make ends meet, and I had no idea this was coming. Saving up to buy back a cabin that should have already been ours wasn't even on my radar. Later that night, I took to Reddit, just trying to get my thoughts down. I posted about everything that had happened, how blindsided I felt, and how it seemed like my dad was playing some kind of sick game. The responses were overwhelming. People were equally shocked and angry on my behalf. Some folks even suggested I should start a GoFundMe or take out a loan, while others told me to cut my losses and move on. But how do you just move on from something that ties you to your childhood, to your mom? The comments were a mix. Some thought my dad had no right to do what he did, and others were like, it's his property. He can do what he wants. There was a lot of debate, but mostly people seemed to get why I was hurt. They shared stories of their own about family betrayals and things they'd lost that they'd never get back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just let it go. I didn't have the funds to buy it outright, but I couldn't just sit back and watch everything my mom loved get erased because my dad needed cash. The idea of my mom's favorite place getting torn down or flipped into some trendy rental made me sick. So now I'm stuck in this limbo, not sure what to do next. I'm trying to figure out who bought it and if there's any chance I can get it back. But every time I talk to my dad, it's just more of the same. He keeps acting like this is my problem now, like I'm the one causing trouble by even bringing it up. And it doesn't end there. My stepmom keeps dropping hints that this is some kind of lesson, that if I want to prove myself, I'll find a way to buy it back. It's exhausting, honestly. I'm not sure if they're testing me, teaching me, or just trying to push me away. But whatever it is, I'm not letting go without a fight. I'll post an update as soon as I figure out my next steps. Right now, I'm just trying to keep my head above water and figure out if there's even a chance I can get the cabin back. Update 1. After my initial post, I knew I needed to dig into what actually happened with the cabin. First, I went to the county records office to see if I could find anything on the sale. Turns out my dad sold the place to a private buyer through a cash deal, which made the transaction airtight and left almost no paper trail I could follow. The whole situation felt so calculated. My dad had never mentioned the cabin was even up for sale, so to find out he went with a private buyer in a quick, cash-only sale just didn't sit right with me. I tried asking around in our family circle, hoping someone knew more than I did, but all I got was either dead ends or people trying to avoid the subject. It seemed like everyone was keeping quiet or didn't want to get involved. I reached out to a couple of cousins on my mom's side who were just as shocked as I was. They couldn't believe my dad would do this without giving us a chance to buy it first. One of them mentioned that my stepmom had been talking about starting fresh and hinted that the cabin was too much of a burden for my dad. That comment confirmed what I'd been feeling. My stepmom probably had a hand in this whole thing. Meanwhile, word started spreading among the rest of the family. My dad's side of the family mostly kept their opinions to themselves, but I could tell they weren't exactly sympathetic. Some of them hinted that my dad had done what he had to do, implying that selling the cabin was somehow justified. This divide in the family made everything more complicated, and it felt like I was standing alone in all of it. As I kept pushing, I learned that the buyer was willing to sell the cabin back to me, but at a much higher price than what my dad received. It was insulting. They knew it was a sentimental property and seemed to be taking advantage of my connection to it. I was stuck between wanting the cabin back and knowing I was being manipulated by both the buyer and my own family. But I knew that if I let it go, I'd regret it forever. In the meantime, every conversation with my dad felt like walking into a trap. He kept pushing me to step up and buy it back if it was so important to me. My stepmom, of course, would chime in with comments about how real family shows their commitment by making sacrifices. They even brought it up at a family dinner, practically turning it into a public guilt trip. I didn't say much then, but I left early that night, more determined than ever to get the cabin back somehow. To get started, I began looking around for ways to raise money. I didn't have much saved, so I started listing anything I could sell online. A few friends noticed and reached out, asking what was going on. When I explained the situation, they offered to help. Some even pitched in by buying items I was selling just to support me. Their support made things feel a bit more hopeful, but I still had a long way to go to match the inflated price the new owner was asking. The whole ordeal with my dad was becoming unbearable. Every time we talked, he'd drop hints about how he and my stepmom had sacrificed so much, and that now it was my turn to prove my dedication. It felt like a twisted game they were playing. I was trying to wrap my head around whether this was some kind of test or if they just wanted me to give up. Either way, the pressure was relentless, and I knew I couldn't keep going like this without taking bigger steps. So I started looking into loan options. The thought of going into debt for this was terrifying, especially since I wasn't exactly financially stable. I knew this decision could set me back, but the alternative was losing the one place that still felt like home. I shared my worries with Reddit, and the response was incredible. People shared advice, offered emotional support, and even shared their own stories of family betrayals and struggles with sentimentality versus financial reality. Their words were a boost I hadn't realized I needed. As the days passed, my dad started pushing even harder. He called me out of the blue one night, saying he'd found another buyer and that I needed to make a decision soon. I tried to ask who the buyer was, but he wouldn't tell me, just saying they were serious and ready to move fast. This felt like another manipulation, but I was starting to wonder if he was bluffing just to get me to make a rushed decision. The timing was too perfect. With my back against the wall, I felt like I had no choice. I posted again, updating everyone on Reddit about the situation and asking if anyone had experience with negotiating in a situation like this. Some people suggested calling my dad's bluff, but others were saying I should be careful not to lose my chance. The pressure was eating me alive, and each day that passed, the cabin felt like it was slipping further out of reach. That night, I lay awake, going over my options again and again. The thought of taking out a loan was risky, but my friends and even some extended family from my mom's side were offering to pitch in, and it felt like a team effort. If I kept moving, maybe I could gather enough to buy it back in time. But every interaction with my dad felt like another wall going up between us. He and my stepmom were making it clear that if I didn't buy it soon, they'd have no problem selling it to someone else. I knew the clock was ticking, and I'd have to decide soon. Either I take the plunge and try to pull the funds together, or I let go and lose the cabin for good. I'll update here once I figure out my next steps. But right now it feels like I'm running out of time, and the walls are closing in. Update 2. After my last update, I knew I had to act fast if I wanted any chance of getting the cabin back. So I turned to my extended family for help. I reached out to aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone who had a connection to the cabin or to my mom's memory. Some relatives were sympathetic and even offered to pitch in, seeing it as a way to honor my mom. Others, especially on my dad's side, weren't so supportive. A couple of my uncles seemed uncomfortable, saying I should respect my dad's decision and that maybe I was being unrealistic about it all. Meanwhile, my stepmom found out about my fundraising attempts, and things got ugly. She started calling me selfish, saying I was only making things harder for everyone. At one family dinner, she made a big deal out of how I was stuck in the past, and that the cabin was a burden my dad had to get rid of. She insisted I should move on and let my dad live his life without clinging to old memories. My dad stayed quiet through the whole thing, which made it even worse. Despite that drama, my friends rallied behind me. A couple of close friends suggested we organize a fundraiser event, something simple, like a community barbecue where people could pitch in a few bucks to help out. I honestly didn't expect much, but the turnout surprised me. People from my town, some I hadn't seen in years, showed up. They knew how much the cabin meant to me, and their support gave me a huge boost. Even small donations started trickling in, which, little by little, began to make a difference. But as I kept pushing forward, a few friends pulled me aside and shared their doubts. They were supportive, but they questioned whether I was too emotionally attached, especially if going after the cabin meant driving a wedge between me and my dad. They didn't want to see me get hurt, and a couple even hinted that maybe I was better off letting it go. Those conversations were hard to swallow, but I couldn't just let go after coming this far. Around this time, something strange happened. I noticed inconsistencies in my dad's story about the sale. He had originally said he sold the cabin because he needed the money, but then he'd drop hints about how the buyer just made an offer he couldn't refuse. It didn't add up. So I did some digging, and a cousin from my mom's side mentioned that my dad had been struggling with debt I'd known nothing about. It seemed like he hadn't been entirely honest about his motives, which made me wonder if there was more he was hiding. Some commenters on Reddit encouraged me to consult a lawyer, so I looked into it. I didn't have the money for a lengthy legal battle, but the lawyer I spoke with gave me some tips on how to handle negotiations. He said that if the current buyer was willing to negotiate, I should jump on it and see if I could bring down the price before getting tied up in anything costly. I reached out to the buyer and asked if they'd be open to a lower price, but they were firm. They said they'd consider a slight reduction, but I'd need to make a decision quickly. It felt like a high-pressure tactic, but I was willing to consider it. Every bit counted at this point, so I told them I'd do my best to get the money together by their deadline. Meanwhile, my mom's side of the family, who had been incredibly supportive, decided to organize their own fundraiser. They saw it as a way to honor my mom's memory, and they reached out to old family friends who had known her. This show of support from them meant a lot, but it also seemed to push my stepmom over the edge. She started saying things like, "The cabin was never promised to you," and implied that my dad had always intended to sell it. Her hostility grew with each step I took, and every time we crossed paths, the tension was almost unbearable. With my stepmom becoming more vocal, my dad chose to avoid me altogether. He dodged my calls, and when I stopped by his place, he was too busy to talk. It was like he'd put up a wall, letting my stepmom handle the fallout instead. That made everything feel even more isolating, as if he'd fully sided with her against me. While sorting through some old things for the fundraisers, I came across one of my mom's journals. Inside, she'd written about her dreams for the cabin, how she'd hoped it would be a place her kids could visit for years to come. She talked about planting trees with us, adding little upgrades over time, and how she envisioned family gatherings there. Finding that journal entry felt like a reminder of why I was fighting so hard for it. But all this was taking a toll. I ended up stepping away from Reddit for a bit to gather myself. The constant stress, the family arguments, the uncertainty, it was all starting to wear me down. I needed a break, even if just for a day or two, to clear my head. When I eventually logged back on, the flood of supportive messages and comments gave me that push I needed to keep going. People were rooting for me, telling me not to give up, and sharing their own stories of family drama and resilience. With everyone's help, we hit a major fundraising milestone that brought us closer to the inflated price. Friends and family chipped in what they could, and the fundraisers were helping. We weren't there yet, but the goal was starting to feel a little more within reach. I'll post again soon as things progress. For now, the plan is to keep raising funds, and hopefully I'll have a solid offer for the buyer soon. With the fundraising making steady progress, I reached out to the buyer to see if they'd be willing to budge on the price. After some back and forth, they finally offered a slight reduction. Not much, but enough to give me a bit of hope. It felt like a small victory, but I still had a long way to go, and time was ticking. Around this time, my dad's attitude shifted. When I told him about my progress and the possibility of buying the cabin back, he got cold. He started dropping comments about how responsibility isn't cheap and warned me about the financial burden of maintaining the place. He seemed almost resentful, like he wanted me to understand the cost of holding onto old memories. His reaction felt strange, considering how supportive he'd been of keeping the cabin in the family before my stepmom came into the picture. I needed answers, so I confronted him directly. I asked why he'd really sold the cabin and pressed him about the financial situation he was facing. At first, he tried to dodge the question, but eventually he let slip that he had massive debts, much bigger than he'd let on. It became clear that the sale of the cabin wasn't just about moving on or starting fresh with my stepmom. It was about covering up a financial mess he'd been hiding for years. Hearing this made everything click. His urgency to sell, the way he avoided discussing the cabin, the dismissive attitude. He was desperate, and I was caught in the crossfire of his financial disaster. The revelation didn't change my determination, but it made me realize just how deep this situation went. Some Redditors suggested I consider a legal route, maybe even sue to reverse the sale, but I knew that option was risky and probably wouldn't work. After consulting a lawyer, I learned that, since the sale was legally binding and the buyer had no involvement in my dad's situation, reversing it would be next to impossible. The only option left was to keep pushing for the funds or walk away. As word of the debt spread through our extended family, some relatives on my dad's side began pressuring him to help cover the remaining costs. They argued that if he was responsible for the sale, he should contribute to the buyback. This only made things worse between us. My stepmom went as far as to say that if I didn't back off, she'd cut off all contact. She claimed I was harassing them and making the family look bad by stirring up drama. Her hostility only made me more determined, but it was hard not to feel the strain with each conversation. With the buyer's reduced offer, I started seriously considering taking out a loan to bridge the gap. It was a tough choice, as the financial risk was significant, and the thought of debt was weighing on me. But every day brought me closer to the possibility of reclaiming the cabin, and the idea of letting it slip away felt even worse. At one point, the stress reached a breaking point. After another argument with my dad, I felt like I was hitting a wall. I started questioning if fighting for the cabin was worth it, especially if it meant tearing apart my relationship with him. For the first time, I considered walking away and letting go, but my friends and family from my mom's side stepped in, reassuring me that I was doing the right thing. Their support kept me grounded, reminding me of why I'd started this journey in the first place. Around this time, I met with the lawyer again to discuss the legal side of things. He confirmed that taking legal action would likely go nowhere. The buyer was well within their rights, and my dad had made sure the sale was locked tight. Any loopholes I'd hoped to find simply weren't there. It was another dead end, but it pushed me to double down on raising the funds. A few friends from my hometown decided to organize a community fundraiser event. They set up a barbecue and some live music, inviting locals to come out and support. The turnout was incredible, with people from all over the community pitching in to help. Even small donations added up, and seeing so many people come together gave me a renewed sense of purpose. It was a reminder that this wasn't just my fight. It was a collective effort, with everyone pulling for me to get that cabin back. Meanwhile, my Reddit post started gaining traction outside of the subreddit. People were sharing it on other platforms, and I noticed a spike in donations. Strangers were reaching out, sharing stories of their own family struggles and offering advice or simply words of encouragement. It felt surreal to have this kind of support from people I'd never met. But every message, every donation, and every story shared kept me moving forward. Finally, I reached out to the buyer one last time for a final negotiation. I explained my situation, my connection to the cabin, and the fundraising efforts. After a long pause, they agreed to reduce the price even further, but on one condition: I'd have to close quickly. It felt like a race against time, but with the new price, it finally felt within reach. As I prepared to make the offer, the reality of what I was about to do set in. This was it, the culmination of months of effort, arguments, and endless fundraising. I knew that securing the cabin wouldn't come without consequences. My relationship with my dad was already fractured, and my stepmom had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with me. Reclaiming the cabin would likely come at the cost of whatever family connections I had left on that side. But as I look back on everything that had happened, I felt more certain than ever that this was worth it. The cabin was more than just a piece of property. It was a piece of my mom, a place where our memories lived on. Now, with the finish line in sight, I'm closer than ever to bringing it back into the family, no matter the fallout that follows. I'll update soon with what happens next. Update 4. After months of struggling, I finally managed to buy the cabin back. It was a bittersweet victory. I'd done it, but the family drama left a permanent scar. The cabin was officially mine again, but my dad and stepmom cut off all contact. The family rift felt deeper than ever, with some relatives taking my side and others standing by my dad. I tried to focus on the win, though. After everything, The cabin was back in my hands. The day I returned to the cabin for the first time since the sale, I realized how much work it needed. It looked like no one had bothered with maintenance since I'd last been there. The roof had leaks, the wood was rotting in some places, and the inside was full of dust and cobwebs. Part of me wondered if my dad had let it fall into disrepair on purpose. It was going to take a lot of time and money to bring it back to how I remembered it. My mom's side of the family stepped in right away. They saw this as a chance to honor her memory, and they offered to help with the renovations. Some of them even brought over supplies, saying it was their way of contributing to the cabin she loved so much. It was touching to see everyone come together, working late into the night to make the place livable again. Even people from the community who knew my mom showed up to lend a hand, and it started feeling like the cabin was more than just mine. It was a piece of everyone who cared about her. On Reddit, the support poured in. People celebrated the success with me, sharing their own stories of family betrayals and the lengths they'd gone to hold onto memories. The post went viral, spreading to other platforms, and strangers from all over reached out to say they were inspired. Some even donated small amounts to help with the repairs, which was more than I could have asked for. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Relatives on my dad's side were split. Some of them were supportive, saying I'd earned it after all the effort, while others echoed my stepmom's sentiments. They said I was tearing the family apart by pushing so hard to get the cabin back. My stepmom even confronted me about it, accusing me of turning everyone against my dad. She claimed he had no choice but to sell the cabin, and that I was selfish for refusing to understand. I didn't argue with her. At this point, I knew we'd never see eye to eye. The cabin renovations turned into a kind of therapy for me. There was something therapeutic about fixing up the place myself. As I patched up the roof, painted the walls, and scrubbed away years of neglect, it felt like I was rebuilding a part of myself too. My friends joined in whenever they could, bringing supplies, helping with repairs, and even organizing potluck dinners to keep everyone's spirits up. The whole process felt like a community effort, and it reminded me that I wasn't alone. The repairs were taking a toll on my finances though. The cabin needed more work than I'd anticipated, and costs started piling up fast. Every time I'd think I'd saved enough to cover a major repair, something else would come up, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. The cabin had become a symbol of everything I'd fought for, and I wasn't about to give up now, no matter the cost. While cleaning out a storage closet, I found an old box of my mom's belongings. Inside were letters, photos, and little keepsakes from our family trips. Holding those memories in my hands made me feel closer to her, like she was still a part of this place. It was a powerful reminder of why I'd gone through all this trouble. I knew then that no matter what happened with my dad or stepmom, I'd made the right choice. As the story spread, donations and support continued to come in. People online were invested in the journey, with many sharing their own experiences of strained family relationships and the lengths they'd gone to preserve memories. The support was overwhelming, and it even attracted a few small local news outlets. The attention wasn't something I'd expected, but it kept me motivated to finish what I'd started. Then, out of the blue, my dad reached out. He didn't apologize or try to make amends, but he did acknowledge that maybe he'd acted in haste. He admitted that his financial issues were worse than he'd let on, and said he regretted how things had gone. However, he made it clear he wasn't ready to reconcile. It was a strange conversation. There was regret in his voice, but no real apology or willingness to make things right. I accepted that this might be the closest we'd get to a resolution. I couldn't change his decisions, and it wasn't my job to make him see my side. I'd reclaimed the cabin, and that was enough. As for my stepmom, she made it clear she wanted no part of my life moving forward, and honestly, I was okay with that. I'd come to terms with the fact that some family ties might never heal. Finally, after weeks of hard work, the cabin was restored. It wasn't perfect, but it was home again. Friends, family, and even a few community members gathered to celebrate, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. We laughed, shared stories about my mom, and even made a toast to her memory. It was a bittersweet ending, but one that felt right. I'll be using the cabin as a retreat, a place to reconnect and build new memories. This journey taught me more than I ever expected about resilience, family, and the power of a community. Whatever happens with my dad and stepmom from here, I know I did what was right for me and my mom's legacy. I'll update again if anything changes. But for now, the cabin is back where it belongs. Thank you to everyone who supported me on this journey. Update 5. After countless hours of work, the final touches on the cabin were complete. The place looked better than ever, with fresh paint, sturdy repairs, and small upgrades here and there. I put so much time and effort into restoring it, and seeing it fully finished brought a quiet sense of closure. The cabin felt whole again, like it was honoring my mom's memory in the way I'd always hoped. I decided to keep the cabin as a retreat, somewhere to escape to when life got too busy. It wasn't just a place to remember my mom. It had become a symbol of independence and resilience. I knew that no matter what else happened in my life, this cabin was mine, and it was here to stay. After the fallout with my dad and stepmom, contact with them became minimal. My dad and I were civil enough when we did talk, but the relationship was different now. There was an unspoken acceptance between us that we might never go back to how things were. My stepmom completely distanced herself, and I accepted that too. In a way, letting go of the need to fix things with them gave me peace. Not every family story ends in reconciliation, and I was okay with that. With my dad and stepmom out of the picture, my connection with the extended family grew stronger. My mom's side of the family had been there for me every step of the way, and their support made us closer than we'd been in years. We started planning family gatherings at the cabin, and it felt like a new beginning for all of us. They saw the cabin as a piece of her legacy too, and their visits turned it into a shared space full of new memories. Reflecting on everything, I realized this journey had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd learned about betrayal, resilience, and the meaning of family. The cabin had been a battle, but it was also a turning point in my life. For the first time, I felt like I'd taken control of my future instead of letting others decide it for me. And the cabin, once just a place to escape to, became a symbol of that growth. I shared an update on Reddit, thanking everyone who'd supported me through the entire journey. The outpouring of encouragement and advice had been invaluable. People had shared their own stories, helped me strategize, and even donated to make the cabin a reality again. I wouldn't have been able to do it without that community, and I wanted them to know how much it meant to me. The comments poured in, full of congratulations and even more personal stories from people who'd gone through similar family conflicts. My friends, who'd supported me both financially and emotionally, became like family in their own right. They were there for me when things got rough, and they stuck around long after the battle was won. I knew I'd never forget what they'd done for me. We started making plans to create new traditions at the cabin, with annual get-togethers and camping trips to keep the place alive with laughter and friendship. One afternoon, I decided to set up a small tribute to my mom in one corner of the cabin. I dedicated a cozy reading nook to her, filled with some of her favorite books and a few old family photos. It felt like the right way to keep her memory alive, without turning the cabin into a shrine. Whenever I sat in that corner, it felt like she was right there with me, and it gave me a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The cabin project became a journey of personal healing. I'd started out focused on the physical restoration, but somewhere along the way, I ended up restoring parts of myself too. The experience taught me a lot about letting go, setting boundaries, and standing up for what matters. It was a long road, but one that left me stronger and more grounded than I'd ever been. The story spread online, drawing attention from people outside Reddit. Random strangers messaged me, sharing similar stories about family conflicts, loss, and the fight to hold onto memories. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone in this kind of struggle. The cabin story had resonated far beyond my small circle, connecting with people who'd faced similar challenges. It was a strange kind of fame, but it brought me peace knowing others could relate. A few weeks after the cabin was finished, we held a celebration event with friends and family. It wasn't anything fancy, just a gathering to mark the end of a long journey. We set up tables outside, had a big barbecue, and shared stories under the stars. There was laughter, music, and a sense of community that I hadn't felt in years. It was a moment of pure happiness, and I knew my mom would have loved it. Not long after the celebration, my dad reached out. It was a brief meeting, and there wasn't much closure. He expressed regret, but stopped short of an apology. It felt like his way of acknowledging what had happened without diving too deep into it. I didn't press for more. We'd both moved on, and I accepted that some things might never fully heal. It was bittersweet, but it was enough. With the cabin restored and the family drama finally settled, I was ready to start a new chapter. This journey had taught me more than I could have imagined, and I was grateful for every lesson. The cabin now stood as a testament to my strength, my family's support, and my mom's legacy. For everyone who followed this story from the beginning, thank you. This experience reminded me of the power of community, and it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Here's to new beginnings, old memories, and the cabin that brought them all together.